the wisdom that creates generational wealth. 12 Life Principles that Build Freedom, Character, and True Wealth. Written by Vincent Cull. Opening scene. Some of the most important lessons I've learned about life didn't come from a classroom or a textbook. They came from standing around the grill with my dad, a beer in hand while he made dinner, the smell of perfectly seasoned meat and smoke hanging in the air. That's when the conversations happened, the stories, the opinions, the observations about life, money, and people. We jokingly called it his soapbox. And for years, that grill became the classroom. I didn't realize it then, but those conversations were quietly teaching me lessons that would take most people an entire lifetime to learn. Lessons I wouldn't fully understand the value of until years later. The lessons my dad shared during those conversations would eventually change the way I thought about wealth. For most of my life, I thought generational wealth meant money, a successful business, a healthy investment account, a house passed down through the family. That's what people usually mean when they talk about wealth that lasts beyond a lifetime. But as I got older, I started to realize something. Money is fragile. It can be spent, mismanaged, inflated away, divided, taxed, lost in bad investments, or disappear within a single generation. History is full of families who built fortunes only to see them vanish within a few decades. But there is another form of wealth that is far more durable. Wisdom, the kind learned through mistakes, hard decisions, failures, successes, relationships, and experience. The kind passed down not in bank accounts, but in conversations, around dinner tables, on long drives, and in moments that didn't seem important at the time. My dad spent more than 60 years collecting those lessons. Some came from business, some from self-education, some from watching people succeed and fail, some from taking risks that worked out and others that didn't. Over time, he began writing them down, capturing the principles he believed mattered most. They weren't complicated ideas. In fact, most were simple. But they were the kind of simple truths that only become clear after decades of living. Along the way, my mother and stepmother contributed their own perspectives as well. Each added pieces of wisdom, shaped by their own experiences and observations about life and people. When I stepped back and looked at everything together, I realized these lessons formed something larger. They formed a framework, a way of approaching life, work, money, relationships, failure, and success. This book is my attempt to organize those lessons so they can be passed forward, not just to my own children someday, but to anyone who understands that building a good life requires more than ambition. It requires perspective, responsibility, character, discipline, and the willingness to keep learning. Inside these pages, you'll find ideas about setting goals and choosing your attitude, learning from failure instead of fearing it, creating value instead of simply working harder, and understanding how money actually behaves. But more importantly, you'll find lessons about life, because real generational wealth isn't just measured in dollars, it's measured in wisdom, carried forward from one generation to the next. One of the first lessons my dad repeated to me over and over again was surprisingly simple. The most important step to achieve your goals is to have goals. At the time, it sounded almost obvious, but like many of the lessons he shared on that backyard soapbox, the deeper meaning only became clear over time. Because the direction of your life is determined long before the results appear. It begins with a decision about where you're going. And that decision starts with a goal. Chapter 1. The Power of Goals. One of the lessons my dad repeated most often during those backyard conversations was deceptively simple. The most important step to achieve your goals is to have goals. At first, it sounded obvious. Of course you need goals. But as I got older, I realized something. Most people don't actually have goals. They have wishes. They have vague intentions. They have someday. And as my dad would say, someday is not a day of the week. There is something powerful about putting a real date on something, a real commitment, a decision tied to time. When you say, "I'll do it someday," what you're really saying is that you're not serious. But when you decide when something will happen, your thinking begins to change. If you don't know what you're looking for, you won't see it when it comes. Goals prime your perception. Without them, opportunities pass unnoticed. With them, doors that were always there suddenly become visible. My dad would often ask a simple question: "What step did you take today?" Because even one small step separates ambition from achievement. But that idea is often misunderstood. When people think about big goals, they focus on the outcome, the finished product, the destination. And because of that, the goal can feel overwhelming before they even begin. Or they try to take on too much at once and burn out. What I've learned over time is that progress doesn't come from massive effort in short bursts. It comes from small, consistent steps repeated over time. That lesson became very real for me through an experience with my stepmother, Maria. One night, she asked me a simple question: "Do you want to run a half marathon with me?" At the time, I wasn't a runner, not even close. But for some reason, I said yes. Shortly after, I found out what I had just agreed to. A half marathon is 13.1 miles. I remember thinking, well, I guess we just need to practice running 13 miles. That seemed like the logical starting point. But Maria saw it differently. Instead of jumping straight into long-distance running, she pulled out a training program called Couch Potato to a 5K. The plan was simple. Start with a 5-minute warm-up walk, then alternate between 60 seconds of jogging and 90 seconds of walking for about 20 minutes. That was it. It didn't feel like training for a half marathon. It barely felt like training at all. But the program was designed to do something. It built progress, gradually. Over time, the intervals increased, the distance grew, the body adapted. And eventually, we completed a full 5K. From there, we followed another program that extended the distance even further, step by step, week by week, until one day we were ready. When race day arrived, we both completed the full 13.1 miles. Looking back, that experience changed the way I think about goals, because the half marathon was never really about running. It was about understanding something much more important. Large goals are not achieved through extreme effort over a short period of time. They are achieved through small, consistent steps over a longer period of time. You identify the goal. You set a date. And then you follow a plan, one step at a time. The road to a goal is never straight. There will be course corrections, setbacks, and detours. Growth is zigzag. But persistence is what transforms a goal into a result. Goals are not about speed. They are about direction. And direction compounds. When you choose a direction and take responsibility for your progress, you stop drifting through life. You begin steering it. And that is the beginning of generational wealth. Chapter 2. Perception creates reality. You may have heard the story about two people walking into a bar during a rainstorm. One cursed the rain, while the other looked for rainbows. The storm was the same. The rain fell equally on both of them. The weather didn't change based on their opinions, but their experience of that moment was completely different. That's perception, and perception is powerful. Growing up, I didn't fully understand how much this shaped my dad's life and eventually mine. I thought success came from intelligence, timing, connections, or opportunity. But over time, I realized something deeper was at work. It was interpretation. Two people can experience the exact same circumstance and walk away with entirely different outcomes. One sees a setback, the other sees a setup. One sees unfairness, the other sees instruction. One sees a closed door, the other starts looking for a window. My dad used to say, happiness is a choice. You can choose to be happy, or you can choose to be miserable. At first, that statement sounded too simple, but the longer I lived, the more truth I found in it. Because circumstances matter, but how you interpret those circumstances matters even more. Your interpretation shapes your response shapes your actions, and your actions shape your future. Two people can walk through the same storm and walk away with completely different lives. Not because the storm was different, but because their perspective was. Perspective changes everything. Two people can face the same challenge, the same setback, or the same obstacle, and walk away with completely different results. One sees defeat, the other sees a lesson. One sees proof they should stop, the other sees a reason to keep going. Because success in life is rarely a straight path. No matter how clear your goals are or how strong your mindset is, there will always be moments when things don't go according to plan. Mistakes will happen, plans will fail, and sometimes the path forward will feel uncertain. That's when another one of my dad's lessons becomes important. Because if you want to succeed at anything meaningful in life, you have to understand something most people try to avoid. Failure isn't the opposite of success. In many ways, it's part of the process. Chapter 3. Failure is the tuition. Fail often, fail early, fail forward. If failure is part of the process, the real question isn't whether you will experience it. The real question is how you choose to respond when it happens. This was another lesson my dad never tried to hide from me. He didn't pretend success came easily. If anything, he talked about the mistakes just as often as the victories, maybe more. Growing up, I started to notice something about the people who eventually succeed. They fail a lot. Not once, not twice, over and over again. But there is a difference between the failures that stop people and the failures that shape them. Some people experience failure and interpret it as a verdict, proof that they aren't capable, proof that the idea was wrong, proof that they should stop trying. Others see failure differently. They see it as tuition, a lesson paid for in experience. Every mistake teaches something. Every setback reveals something that wasn't obvious before. Every failed attempt contains information that can make the next attempt better. When you start looking at failure that way, it stops feeling like the end of the road. It starts feeling like part of the journey. My dad often pointed out that successful people tend to fail more than unsuccessful people. Not because they are less capable, but because they are willing to try more things. They take more chances, they test more ideas, they pursue more opportunities. And when something doesn't work, they adjust and keep moving forward. If you never attempt anything that might fail, you might avoid embarrassment, you might avoid disappointment, but you will also avoid opportunity. Eventually, you fail by default. Because progress in life almost always requires stepping into situations where the outcome isn't guaranteed. Starting a business involves risk. Changing careers involves risk. Pursuing a new idea involves risk. Trying something you've never done before involves risk. And risk always carries the possibility of failure, but it also carries the possibility of growth. Failure has a way of revealing the truth about our plans, our assumptions, and sometimes even ourselves. It shows us what works, it shows us what doesn't, and if we're willing to learn from it, it often points us toward a better path than the one we originally imagined. The people who eventually succeed aren't the ones who avoid failure. They're the ones who refuse to let failure stop them. They treat every setback as information. They adjust, they learn, they try again. Over time, those lessons accumulate, and eventually, what once looked like failure becomes the experience that made success possible. Because failure, when understood correctly, isn't something to fear. It's simply the price of learning something valuable. And the people who are willing to pay that price often discover opportunities that others never see. But even when you accept that failure is part of the process, another challenge appears. Because after failure comes a choice. You can blame circumstances. You can blame bad luck. You can blame other people. Or you can take responsibility for what happens next. And that choice, the decision to accept responsibility instead of making excuses, is where real progress begins. It's also where another one of my dad's lessons comes into play. Chapter 4. Radical Responsibility. You are 100% responsible for everything that happens to you. This was one of the hardest lessons my dad ever taught me, not because it was complicated, but because it was uncomfortable. When something goes wrong in life, our first instinct is usually to look outward. The economy, the boss, the customer, the timing, the competition, bad luck. There is always something we can point to, and sometimes those things are real. But my dad had a very different way of looking at it. He believed that no matter what happens, you are still responsible for how you respond. That idea changes everything. At first, the statement can feel harsh. It almost sounds unfair. After all, there are plenty of things in life that truly are outside our control. But responsibility is not about blame. It's about control. If everything that happens to you is someone else's fault, then your future is in someone else's hands. But if you accept responsibility, even when the situation isn't entirely your fault, you regain something incredibly powerful. You regain the ability to act. You regain the ability to adapt. You regain control of the next step. My dad would often say excuses cannot convert failure into success. They might make you feel better for a moment, but they don't change the outcome. Only action does that. Over time, I realized that responsibility is actually one of the most empowering ideas a person can adopt. Because if you are responsible for where you are also capable of changing where you are going. You don't have to be a victim of circumstance. You become the author of your response. My dad liked to say, "We are not stuck in traffic. We are the traffic." It's a funny line, but it carries a deeper point. Most of us move through life believing things are happening to us, but in reality, we are often part of the system we're frustrated with. When you shift your perspective from victim to participant, everything changes. Instead of asking, "Why is this happening to me?" you start asking, "What can I do about it?" That question is where progress begins. Because the moment you accept full responsibility for your life is the moment you reclaim the power to change it. And that power is one of the most valuable forms of generational wealth you can pass on. But once you take responsibility for your life, something else becomes harder to ignore. The reality that your time is limited. And how you choose to spend it will ultimately define everything that follows. Chapter 5. Time is the ultimate currency. Time is the most valuable asset you will ever possess. At the age of 29, I was diagnosed with stage 3 colon cancer. I remember lying in the hospital bed, my wife and mother standing at the foot of it when the doctor broke the news. A silence filled the room as we all tried to process what we had just been told. It was in that silence that I experienced a type of clarity I had never felt before. I remember asking myself, if this ends up being the end of my journey, how will I be remembered? Did I accomplish everything I wanted to accomplish in life? And my answer was no. That realization forced me to examine how I had lived my life up to that point. The truth was, I hadn't accomplished what I wanted to accomplish yet, largely because I believed I had more time. Like most people, I had always assumed there would be another tomorrow. But lying in that hospital bed, tomorrow suddenly felt uncertain. In that moment, many of the things that once seemed important suddenly felt insignificant. The daily worries, the minor frustrations, the things that once consumed my attention, they all faded into the background. What remained was something much simpler. Time. I began questioning everything. What had I really done with my life? Had I spent my time well? Had I invested it in the things that truly mattered? For the first time, I realized that time was the one thing I had always assumed I would have more of. But time is different from almost everything else in life. Money can be earned again. Opportunities can appear again. Possessions can be replaced, but time is different. Once it passes, it never comes back. That moment forced me to confront something many people spend their entire lives avoiding. How you spend your time is how you spend your life. And if time truly is the most valuable currency we have, then how we invest it matters more than almost anything else. When you begin to see time this way, it changes how you think about everything. It changes how you think about your priorities. It changes how you think about your relationships. And it especially changes how you think about money. Because most people spend their lives trading their time for it. We work a certain number of hours, and in return, we receive a certain amount of money. At first glance, this arrangement feels normal. In fact, it's how most of the world operates. But once you understand how valuable time truly is, an important question begins to surface. Is trading time for money the only way to build wealth? Or is there another way? That question led me to rethink something most of us rarely question: the way we define assets and liabilities. In school, we are taught that an asset is something you own that has value, and a liability is something you owe. From an accounting perspective, those definitions are correct. But when you begin to view the world through the lens of time, those definitions start to feel incomplete. Because if time is truly our most valuable asset, then anything that constantly requires you to trade your time for money begins to look less like an asset and more like a liability. And that realization leads to an important question. What is an asset really? Chapter 6. What is an asset? After my experience with cancer, I began looking at wealth differently. Before that moment, like many people, I thought about assets and liabilities, mostly the way we're taught in school. In accounting classes, the definitions are very clear. An asset is something you own that has value. A liability is something you owe. From a technical standpoint, those definitions are correct. They work perfectly well on a balance sheet. But when you step outside the classroom and start looking at real life, those definitions can feel incomplete. My dad tried to teach me this lesson at an early age. Every year, my Aunt Amy would host Christmas at her house. After spending time together and sharing a meal, the whole family would gather in the living room to open gifts. That year, my dad handed me one of the biggest presents under the tree and said, "This is one of the strangest gifts I've ever gotten you, but there's a lesson behind it." I remember staring at it most of the night, trying to figure out what it could be. When it was finally my turn to open it, I was excited and a little confused. The box was heavy. When I unwrapped it, I paused. Inside was a candy machine, the kind where you drop a quarter in and it dispenses candy. I hadn't asked for a candy machine. I didn't have a place to put it, and I had no idea why he got it for me. I remember thinking, what am I supposed to do with this? That's when my dad explained it. The candy machine wasn't just a gift, it was a perfect representation of a true asset. Its purpose was simple: to make money for you without you having to be there all the time. At the time, it sounded like a simple explanation, but what he was really showing me was something deeper. It was a way of thinking about money, a way of thinking about time, a way of thinking about how income is created. And once I started to look at the world through that lens, I began to notice something. Many people were describing the same idea in different ways. Some entrepreneurs simplify it even further. They say, an asset is anything that puts money in your pocket. A liability is anything that takes money out of your pocket. That definition is a step closer to reality. But even that definition still misses something. It ignores time. And once you realize that time is the most valuable currency you possess, the way you define assets and liabilities begins to change again. Because the real question becomes this: does this require my time to produce income, or does it continue producing income even when I'm not working? That's exactly what my dad was trying to show me with that candy machine. Once it's placed somewhere and filled, it can continue producing income, whether you're standing next to it or not. And that's what makes it different. A true asset puts money in your pocket without constantly requiring your time. A liability is any situation where you must continually trade your time in order to earn money. That distinction matters more than most people realize, because most people spend their entire lives selling their time. You work a certain number of hours, you receive a certain amount of money. But there is a limitation built into that system. There are only so many hours in a day, and only so many hours you can work, which means income based purely on time will always have a ceiling. Assets break that ceiling. They allow your effort to extend beyond the hours you personally work. They create leverage. Instead of trading time directly for money, you begin building things that continue working even when you're not. Just like that candy machine. And when that happens, something changes. You begin to regain control over your time. You begin to create options. You begin to create freedom. But building assets is rarely easy. It requires patience. It requires uncertainty. It requires delayed gratification. And perhaps most importantly, it requires the willingness to step into situations where the outcome is not guaranteed. And that leads to a question. If building assets can create freedom, why don't more people do it? And the answer often comes down to something simple. Risk. Chapter 7. Risk. Avoiding risk is often the biggest risk of all. Fear of risk is one of the most powerful forces shaping the decisions people make about their lives. Once you begin to understand what an asset truly is, something that can generate value without constantly demanding your time, another question naturally appears. If assets can create freedom, why don't more people build them? The answer is simple. Risk. Building assets requires uncertainty. It requires patience. It requires stepping into situations where the outcome isn't guaranteed. And for many people, that uncertainty feels uncomfortable enough to avoid entirely. But the truth is, risk is not something you can avoid. Every person takes risks, every single day, whether they realize it or not. Driving a car is a risk. Starting a business is a risk. Investing money is a risk. Working for someone else for 40 years is also a risk. Life itself is full of uncertainty. The difference between people is not whether they face risk. The difference is which risks they choose to take. Some people choose the risk of uncertainty. Others choose the risk of predictability. One of the reasons many people avoid building assets is because of the way the human brain is wired. Psychologists have discovered that the pain of losing something is felt much more strongly than the pleasure of gaining the same thing. In simple terms, losing $1,000 hurts far more than gaining $1,000 feels good. This instinct once helped humans survive. For thousands of years, avoiding loss meant avoiding danger. But in modern life, that same instinct can hold people back. It causes us to overestimate the pain of failure and underestimate the opportunity on the other side of it. The fear of losing money, the fear of looking foolish, the fear of making the wrong decision. Those fears can be powerful enough to keep someone standing still for years. But standing still is not the same as being safe. In fact, sometimes it's the opposite. Many people believe the safest path in life is to avoid risk completely. They pursue stability, predictability, security, but there is a hidden risk in that approach. If your entire financial life depends on trading your time for money, your income depends entirely on your ability to keep working. Your health, your energy, your motivation, your time, and none of those things are guaranteed. Calculated risk is different from reckless risk. Calculated risk means understanding the potential downside while recognizing the potential upside. It means stepping forward thoughtfully, not blindly. Every meaningful achievement in life involves some form of risk. Starting a company, changing careers, investing in something new, pursuing a dream. Each of these choices carries uncertainty, but they also carry possibility. And the truth is, the most meaningful progress in life often happens just outside the boundaries of what feels comfortable. The people who build assets, create opportunities, and design lives with more freedom tend to share one trait: tolerate uncertainty longer than most people. They are willing to endure short-term discomfort in exchange for long-term freedom, because in the end, every person will take risks. The real question is simply this: will you take the risk of building something greater or the risk of never trying at all? But even when someone is willing to take calculated risks, another challenge appears. Because building assets usually requires something else first: money to invest. And that leads to another question. If someone wants to build assets and take those calculated risks, where does that money come from in the first place? That question leads us to the next lesson: living below your means. Chapter 8. Live below your means. Financial freedom begins with spending less than you earn. If building assets requires risk, patience, and long-term thinking, another question naturally follows. Where does the money come from to build those assets in the first place? For most people, the answer isn't winning the lottery or receiving a large inheritance. In fact, those paths rarely lead to lasting wealth. Studies have shown that many lottery winners eventually lose everything, and inherited wealth often disappears just as quickly. In other words, sudden money rarely solves the real problem, because wealth isn't created by receiving money. It's created by how you manage it. For most people, the starting point is far less dramatic. It begins with a habit, a simple decision repeated over and over again. Living below your means. Spend less than you earn. Save the difference. Use that difference to build something that will eventually produce income on its own. It's not complicated, but that doesn't mean it's easy. One of the biggest traps people fall into is something called lifestyle inflation. As income increases, spending tends to increase along with it. A raise leads to a bigger house. A promotion leads to a newer car. A higher income leads to higher monthly obligations. Over time, the extra money disappears into a more expensive lifestyle. From the outside, it may look like someone is becoming wealthier, but often the opposite is happening. Their liabilities are growing faster than their assets, and as a result, they become more dependent on their next paycheck, not less. This is why many people who earn high incomes still live paycheck to paycheck. The issue isn't always how much they earn, it's how much they keep. Living below your means creates something incredibly important: margin. And margin is where opportunity lives. Margin allows you to save. Margin allows you to invest. Margin allows you to take calculated risks. Without margin, even the best opportunities become difficult to pursue. Because when every dollar you earn is already committed, there is no room to build anything new. But margin doesn't just create opportunity. It creates peace of mind. When your expenses are lower than your income, you gain flexibility. You gain options. You gain the ability to think long-term. Unexpected events become manageable instead of devastating, and decisions become clearer. When someone is financially stretched, every decision becomes urgent. They have to take the next paycheck. They have to maintain their current income. They can't afford to step away or change direction. But when someone has margin, they gain the ability to think differently. They can choose better opportunities. They can walk away from bad ones. They can invest in their future. Living below your means is not about deprivation. It's about intentionality. It means deciding what truly matters to you and aligning your spending with those priorities. It means resisting the pressure to keep up with everyone else, because there will always be someone with a bigger house, a nicer car, a more expensive lifestyle. But the goal is not to appear wealthy. The goal is to become free. Freedom comes from control over your time, and control over your time begins with control over your money. Living below your means may not be glamorous. It rarely attracts attention, but it is one of the most reliable paths to financial independence that exists. Because the money you choose not to spend today can become the asset that gives you freedom tomorrow. And over time, that freedom gives you something even more valuable than money. It gives you the ability to learn. Because when you create margin in your life, you gain the time and space to seek out new ideas, new perspectives, and new teachers. And that's where another form of wealth begins to appear. Not financial wealth, but wisdom. Chapter 9. Mentors You Will Never Meet. Some of the most important lessons in my life came from standing around that grill with my dad, listening to him share stories and observations about how the world works. At the time, it just felt like conversation. A beer in hand, smoke in the air, dinner cooking. But looking back now, I realized those moments were something more. They were mentorship. My dad was passing down lessons he had learned over decades. Lessons shaped by his own experiences, mistakes, successes, and by the people who had influenced him along the way. And the more I've thought about it over the years, the more I've come to understand something. Many of the mentors who shape our lives are people we may never meet. When we think about mentorship, we often picture someone guiding us directly, a coach, a teacher, a boss, a parent. And those relationships can be incredibly powerful. But mentorship doesn't always happen face-to-face. Sometimes the people who shape the way we think are people we learn from at a distance, through their ideas, through their stories, through the lessons they leave behind. We live in a world where wisdom is more accessible than it has ever been in human history. Books, podcasts, music, interviews, biographies, conversations. The experiences of others are all around us, waiting to be learned from. And yet, many people move through life as if they have to figure everything out on their own. They repeat the same mistakes others have already made. They struggle through challenges someone else has already solved. Not because the answers aren't available, but because they never went looking for them. One of the most valuable habits a person can develop is the habit of learning from others. You can learn from the people who succeed. You can learn from the people who fail. You can learn from the people you admire, and you can even learn from people you strongly disagree with. Every person you encounter has a story. Every life contains lessons. Some of those lessons are worth following. Others are warnings about what not to do. But both can be valuable. Over time, I realized something else about mentorship. Wisdom rarely comes from a single source. It accumulates. My dad's lessons didn't appear out of nowhere. They were shaped by his parents, by the people he worked with, by the mistakes he made, by the books he read, by the experiences he lived through. Each generation adds something. Each person passes something forward. And whether we realize it or not, we all stand on the shoulders of those who came before us. Some of those mentors are close enough to shake our hands. Others lived decades or even centuries before we were born. But their lessons remain, and if we are willing to seek them out, they can influence our lives just as powerfully as any conversation around a dinner table. There's an old saying that captures this idea well. When the student is ready, the teacher will appear. Sometimes that teacher is a parent, sometimes it's a friend. Sometimes it's a stranger whose story changes the way you see the world. And sometimes it's a voice you discover in a book late at night. The important thing is not where the lesson comes from. The important thing is whether we are willing to learn. Because the moment you adopt the mindset of a lifelong student, the world becomes full of mentors. You begin to notice the wisdom hidden in everyday experiences. You begin to recognize the patterns in other people's successes and failures. You begin to realize that life leaves clues everywhere. But mentorship carries another responsibility as well. At some point, every student becomes the teacher. The lessons you learn from others eventually become the lessons you pass forward. Just like my dad did, standing around that grill. At the time, he probably didn't think of himself as a mentor. He was just sharing what he had learned. But those conversations shaped the way I think about life, money, risk, responsibility, and time. And now those lessons are being passed forward again. That's how generational wisdom works. One person learns, they share what they know. Someone else carries those lessons forward, and the cycle continues. Which means the question isn't only, who are your mentors? The question is also, what lessons will you pass forward? Because the knowledge you gain, the mistakes you learn from, and the wisdom you collect throughout your life may one day become the guidance someone else needs. Just like the lessons my dad shared with me, standing around a grill, talking about life. But learning is only part of the equation, because knowledge alone doesn't create change. You still need the energy, clarity, and strength to apply it. And that brings us to something many people don't think about until it's too late: your health. Chapter 10. Health is the foundation. Without health, everything else becomes fragile. When people talk about success, they usually talk about things you can measure: money, career achievements, business growth, investments, possessions. But there is something far more important that sits underneath all of those things. And most people don't think about it until something forces them to. Health. Health is the foundation that everything else in life is built on. Without it, the goals you set, the money you earn, the plans you make, and the opportunities you pursue all become much harder to sustain. I learned that lesson earlier in life than I expected. At the age of 29, I was diagnosed with stage 3 colon cancer. That moment changed the way I saw the world. Lying in that hospital bed forced me to confront a question many people spend their entire lives avoiding. Have I spent my time well? When something like that happens, your perspective shifts quickly. The things that once seemed urgent suddenly feel trivial. The arguments, the stress, the small frustrations, they begin to fade. What remains are the things that truly matter: your time, your relationships, your purpose. Moments like that remind you of something many people forget. You can always earn more money. You can rebuild a business. You can start over. But your health is not something you can take for granted. And once it's compromised, everything else in life becomes harder. There is an old observation that captures this perfectly. People often spend the first half of their lives sacrificing their health to make money. Then they spend the second half of their lives spending money trying to regain their health. It's a cycle many people fall into without even realizing it. They work longer hours, they sleep less, they ignore warning signs. They delay taking care of themselves because they believe there will always be time later. But time and health are closely connected. When one disappears, the other becomes far more valuable. That's why health is not just a personal issue. It's a strategic one. If your goal is to build a meaningful life, one where you have the time and energy to pursue your goals, enjoy your relationships, and make a difference, your health has to be part of the equation. That doesn't mean living in fear of every possible health risk, but it does mean recognizing something. Your body is the vehicle that carries you through life. If that vehicle breaks down, everything else slows down with it. Taking care of your health is not selfish, it's responsible. It allows you to show up fully for the people who depend on you. It allows you to pursue your goals with energy and clarity. And it allows you to make the most of the time you've been given. Health also influences something else many people overlook: your ability to think clearly. When you're exhausted, stressed, or physically struggling, your decision-making suffers. Your patience disappears. Your focus weakens, your perspective narrows. But when you are physically well, everything else becomes easier. You think more clearly. You respond to challenges more calmly. You make better long-term decisions. In other words, health doesn't just extend your life, it improves the quality of the life you live. And when you combine health with everything we've talked about so far, something powerful begins to happen. You begin to build a life with balance. A life where success is not measured only in dollars, but in the ability to live with purpose, clarity, and strength. Because the goal is not simply to accumulate wealth. The goal is to build a life that is meaningful, A life where you have the time and energy to pursue what matters most. Because in the end, wealth without health is fragile. Success without health is unsustainable. And time without health is difficult to enjoy. Which is why protecting your health is not separate from building a meaningful life. It is one of the most important parts of it. And once you begin to see life that way, something else becomes clear. Success is not only about what you build, it's also about how you make people feel along the way. And that raises an important question. What kind of impact do you have on the people around you? Chapter 11. Choose peace when possible. The way you treat people will outlast almost everything else you do. As I've reflected on the lessons that shaped my life, many of them came from my dad, but not all of them. Some of the most important lessons came from my mom. My mom had a way of explaining things simply, but in a way that stayed with you long after the conversation ended. One thing she used to say often was this: people will forget what you said. People will forget what you did. But people will never forget how you made them feel. The older I get, the more I realize how true that is. Most people spend a lot of time worrying about how they appear to others, how successful they look, how impressive their accomplishments are, how much they have achieved. But when people think back on their interactions with you years later, those are rarely the things they remember. What they remember is how they felt when they were around you. Did they feel respected? Did they feel valued? Did they feel heard? Or did they feel dismissed, judged, or small? The emotional impact we leave on people often lasts far longer than the details of anything we accomplish. That's why relationships matter more than most people realize. You can build a successful business. You can accumulate wealth. You can achieve impressive goals. But if you leave a trail of damaged relationships behind you, that success begins to feel empty. Because in the end, people don't measure your life by the size of your accomplishments. They measure it by the way you treated them. This is one of the reasons my mom emphasized something simple. If it's possible, choose peace. That doesn't mean avoiding difficult conversations. It doesn't mean allowing others to take advantage of you. But it does mean recognizing that unnecessary conflict rarely improves anyone's life. Sometimes the strongest decision you can make is choosing not to escalate a situation. Sometimes the wisest move is letting go of an argument that ultimately doesn't matter. And sometimes the best path forward is choosing understanding instead of pride. There will always be moments in life where disagreement is unavoidable. People will see things differently. They will have different priorities, different values, and different perspectives. But disagreement does not have to turn into hostility. And being right is not always the same thing as being wise. Over time, I've learned that some of the most damaging conflicts in life come from situations that didn't need to become conflicts at all. A careless comment, a wounded ego, a moment where someone felt the need to win instead of understand. But the opposite is also true. Small acts of patience, kindness, and humility can strengthen relationships in ways that last for years. A moment of understanding, a willingness to listen, a decision to respond calmly instead of reacting emotionally. Those choices shape how people remember you, and over the course of a lifetime, those memories accumulate. Because long after the details of our accomplishments fade, the emotional impact we had on others remains. That impact becomes part of the story people tell about us. In many ways, it becomes part of the wake we leave behind. And that raises an important question. When people think about you years from now, how will they remember feeling when they were around you? Chapter 12. The Wake You Leave Behind. The true measure of a life is the impact it leaves behind. My dad used to say something that stuck with me over the years. Make a difference. At first, it sounded like a simple piece of advice, but like many of the lessons he shared, its meaning became clearer with time. One day, he explained it with an image I've never forgotten. He told me to imagine your life like a boat moving across a lake. As the boat moves forward, it leaves a wake behind it. That wake spreads outward, touching everything in its path. The boat eventually moves on, but the wake continues long after it passes. He told me that a person's life works the same way. Every decision you make, every relationship you build, every action you take creates a wake behind you. Sometimes that wake is small, sometimes it's large, but it always exists. The question is not whether your life will create a wake. The question is what kind of wake you will leave behind. Many people spend their lives focused on what they accumulate: money, possessions, achievements, status. But when a life is over, those things rarely become the most important part of the story. People don't gather together and remember the size of someone's bank account. They remember something much more personal. They remember how that person treated others. They remember the opportunities they created. They remember the encouragement they gave. They remember the difference they made in the lives around them. That is the wake that lasts. Throughout this book, we've talked about goals, perception, failure, responsibility, time, assets, risk, and discipline. All of those lessons matter. They help you build a life with direction and freedom. But the purpose of those things is not simply to accumulate wealth. The purpose is to create the ability to live intentionally, to use your time wisely, to help others, to contribute something meaningful. In other words, to make a difference. Sometimes people imagine that making a difference requires something extraordinary: starting a global movement, building a massive company, changing the world in a dramatic way. But in reality, most meaningful impact happens in smaller moments. Helping someone believe in themselves, sharing a lesson that prevents someone from repeating your mistakes, offering encouragement when someone is struggling, treating people with respect and kindness. These moments may seem small in the moment, but over time they ripple outward, just like the wake behind a boat. One conversation can influence a decision. One lesson can shape someone's thinking. One act of kindness can change the direction of someone's day. And those ripples continue spreading in ways we may never fully see. Looking back now, I realize that the conversations around the grill with my dad were exactly that. They were ripples. He probably didn't think of himself as teaching anything formal. He was simply sharing what he had learned. Stories from his life, observations about people, lessons about responsibility, money, risk, and time. But those conversations shaped the way I think about the world. They shaped the decisions I make, and now those same lessons are being passed forward again. That's how generational wisdom works. One person learns something through experience. They pass that lesson on. Someone else carries it forward, and the wake continues. When you think about your own life this way, something becomes clear. Your influence reaches farther than you think. The way you treat people, the values you demonstrate, the lessons you share, the example you set. All of these things create ripples that move outward into the lives around you. And long after the details of your accomplishments fade, those ripples continue. Which brings us back to the idea of generational wealth. Money can disappear quickly, but wisdom is different. When wisdom is shared, it multiplies. When lessons are passed forward, they continue influencing lives long after the original teacher is gone. That is the kind of wealth that truly lasts. And that is the kind of wealth my dad was passing on all those years ago, standing around that grill. Final chapter. Generational wealth. Throughout this book, we've talked about many different ideas: goals, perception, failure, responsibility, time, assets, risk, discipline, health, relationships. At first glance, those lessons may seem like separate topics, but they all point toward the same larger idea: how we choose to live our lives. For most of my life, I believed generational wealth meant money. It meant leaving behind a successful business, an investment portfolio, a house, something tangible that could be passed from one generation to the next. But the older I've gotten, the more I've realized that money alone rarely survives across generations. History shows this again and again. Families build fortunes. Those fortunes grow. Then slowly, over time, they disappear. Sometimes through poor decisions, sometimes through lack of discipline, sometimes simply because the next generation never learned the lessons that created the wealth in the first place. Money without wisdom is fragile, but wisdom is different. Wisdom compounds. It grows stronger as it is shared. And when it is passed forward from one generation to the next, it becomes something far more powerful than money alone. It becomes generational wealth in its truest form. The lessons my parents and step-parents shared with me were not complicated ideas. Most of them were simple, sometimes surprisingly simple. But simplicity does not make them less powerful. In fact, the most valuable lessons in life are often the ones that sound obvious at first. Have goals, choose your attitude, learn from failure, take responsibility. Protect your time, build assets, live below your means, take care of your health, treat people well, make a difference. None of those ideas are revolutionary on their own, but when they are lived consistently over time, they create something remarkable. They shape the direction of a life. They influence the opportunities a person sees. They guide the decisions someone makes. And over time, those decisions accumulate. Just like the wake behind a boat. One choice influences the next. One lesson shapes another. And gradually, the life you build begins to reflect the principles you follow. That is how wisdom becomes wealth. Not through a single moment, but through thousands of small decisions made over the course of a lifetime. When I think back to those evenings standing around the grill with my dad, I realize something now that I didn't understand then. Those conversations were never really about money. They were about perspective, character, understanding how the world works. And most importantly, they were about passing those lessons forward. Because the real value of wisdom is not just in learning it, it's in sharing it. Every generation faces its own challenges, its own opportunities, its own decisions about what kind of life to build. But the lessons that help guide those decisions can be carried forward. From parents to children, from mentors to students, from one generation to the next. That is the kind of inheritance that truly lasts. Money may come and go. Businesses may rise and fall, but the principles that shape how we think, how we act, and how we treat others can continue influencing lives for decades, even centuries, if they are passed forward. And that is the hope behind this book, that the lessons shared here might continue the ripple that started years ago in simple conversations around a backyard grill, that the wisdom passed down to me might now be passed forward again. To my children, to your children, to anyone willing to pause long enough to reflect on the kind of life they want to build. Because at the end of the day, the true measure of generational wealth is not found in bank accounts. It's found in the ideas, values, and lessons that continue shaping lives long after we're gone. And if those lessons help someone make better decisions, treat people better, use their time more wisely, or make a difference in the lives around them, then the wealth continues. And the wake keeps moving forward. Because in the end, that's how wisdom lives on. And maybe one day, you'll find yourself standing around a grill, sharing your own lessons with someone who's listening more closely than you realize. Not because you planned it, but because that's how wisdom moves forward. One conversation at a time.